Hello, everybody, and welcome here to the Wine with Jimmy channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. This is all about wine education. So if you're just into wine and want to learn more, then you'll find information across multiple videos that I put together. But massively, if you are studying the world of wine, you'll find these videos very important as they cover key text and key syllabus for major wine qualifications. Welcome to my Virginia mini series. If you do have a comment or question, please do get in touch, potentially about Virginia or about the Diploma D6 unit, about any kind of technical details. Please do pop your question below this video. It'll be great to hear from you. So the first part of my Virginia mini series, the first series, is going to be looking only at the history. I'm going to cover it in great detail as in reference to wine production through the 16th to 21st century. So 16th century, the formation of Virginia, all the way up to today. The first part on the 16th and 17th centuries, this video, is available as free content. But part 2 and part 3, which covers 18th, 19th through to 21st centuries, is only available to those of you who subscribe to my Virginia mini series. The link and information is found below this video in the description. So let's start to talk about Virginia. I'm going to go through everything to do with wine, of course, but the first slide is just setting the scene about Virginia itself. And we go back to 1585 when Sir Walter Raleigh, a very famous intrepid explorer, goes to North America and travels from North Carolina to present-day Florida, naming the landscape Virginia. And that's in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, who is called the Virgin Queen. So that's where Virginia comes from. The actual whole Virginia back then stretches from Maine, so that's north of Boston, Mass, and all the way down to the Carolinas, so a large expanse of the eastern seaboard. Of course, today it is one state which is found south of Washington, D.C., next to West Virginia, next to Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina. So it's much smaller today, but it's just giving you an idea of this landscape. Interestingly, Walter Raleigh never stepped foot in Virginia, so he stayed firmly on board his ship, just to give you that nice little bit of information. Now, in terms of importance for the first records of wine production or wine discussion, we need to go to 1606. And in fact, we're going to go to the 10th of April, 1606. And this is the establishment of the Virginia Company by King James I of England, with the objective of colonizing the east coast of the Americas. Now, the company's shareholders were Londoners, and a year later, in April 1607, the first English explorers landed at Cape Henry, and today we call that Virginia Beach, and they noticed when barrels of wine were brought on shore, they kind of went, okay, we need to do something about wine out here on this new world. Now, in May of the same year, 1607, the Virginia Company officially establishes Jamestown about 60 miles north. Now, the Virginia Company, a lot of the gentlemen of the company at Jamestown encountered a number of native grape species. Among them was the very distinctive vitis, which is called Vitis rotundifolia. So Vitis rotundifolia, which means the round leaf grape. Now, this used to grow on the bottomlands, so riverbeds, in and around swamplands. And often one vine would cover a lot of landscape, so often multiple square feet, almost resembling trees. Now, on reaching the James River, they at once saw a great store of vines of largeness like a man's thigh. So that's the thickness of the trunk, running up to the tops of the trees in great abundance. And that excerpt actually is from the Jamestown Voyages under the First Charter, 1606 to 1609. We then come to the experimentation of winemaking happening in those first years. A report by an Irish sailor who made the first voyage to Jamestown explained that he sampled one or two of the wines produced and he found them very similar to the Spanish Alicante. But this perhaps was more of an Irish fantasy rather than a sober report. A more modest statement was made by one of the promoters of the Virginia Company, who wrote in 1609, "We doubt not but to make there in a few years a store of good wine in comparison to wines from the Canaries." Remembering that the Canary Islands was really one of the most important first stopping points for the fleets heading out from Western Europe to the New World. So it'd often go through the Canaries to stock up and trade and gain more labor and then head off to the New World. So the trade going through the Canaries of different vines is exceptionally important. You only have to look at Listan Prieto from Spain, which comes to the Canaries and then on to the New World, where it's called the Mission grape, and then further things like Criolla in South America. Now, word about the Virginian wine had reached England by 1610. An important gentleman called Thomas West, who was the 12th Baron de la Warr, as you'll see here, Lord de la Warr. He is the governor of the colony at this time. Now, a bit of etymology for you. If you look at de la Warr, or maybe you could pronounce it de la Ware, now that is in fact what the Delaware River is named after, this gentleman, the Delaware River, and of course importance in terms of a state. Now, this lord, he rescues the colony from abandonment, imposing strict military-like regime and attacking the Indians, a story for another day, of course, but pushing them back and protecting the colony. He sent instructions in advance of his arrival that a hogshead or two of the native wine, sour as it is, should be sent for sample to England. He probably hoped that by sending some wine back to England would gain interest from grape growers and winemakers from around Western Europe to come out and to utilize their expertise. And that's really where we lead on to here. This next slide is what I call the lure of wine and silk. Now, this is a bit of propaganda, a bit of promotion to lure people out to the Jamestown colony and around in order to actually gain better expertise in the landscape. And we know that there were 8 vignerons, 8 winemakers sent to Virginia in 1619. Frenchmen mainly from the Languedoc in South France, including Elias Lagarre, David Poul, and Jacques Bonnuel. And they settled around the Elizabeth City County area close to the coast. Actually, Jacques Bonnuel wrote the first manual in the colony for wine growing, but it was little regarded because the real focus in this first 10 years was on tobacco plantation and growing, as it was the most successful crop at that time. So you can immediately see that wine was having a difficulty establishing a foothold because of the cash crop of tobacco. 4 years later, an act of the Assembly directed that all the French vignerons and their families be forbidden to plant tobacco as a punishment for their crimes. They had, it was asserted, willfully concealed their skills of winemaking, neglected to plant any vines themselves, and they had also spoiled and ruinated the vineyard, which was at great cost to the Virginia Company. So they basically had landed with the promise of really growing grapes and making wine, but had quickly moved to tobacco because it was the cash crop. Another group of Frenchmen went out about 10 years after this, in 1630, to plant vines, olives, and to make silk and salt, under the direction of Baron de Sens. Their settlement on the lower James may have yielded salt, yes, but not any of the others. So no vines, no olives, and no silk. And that is really testament to the difficulties of these early settlements. There is a picture there of Sir Edwin Sandys, who was a founder of the VA Company, the Virginia Company, and encouraged French Huguenots to settle in the area to gain their expertise. In 1622, some Virginia wine was sent to London. It must have been from native grapes because the first vines were planted potentially of European stock by those French vignerons in 1619, 1620. They would not have come to fruition really until 1623. So it's native vine wine. And then the problem was it was put into a cask. That cask was spoilt because it was a musty cask. And the long voyage coupled with that spoilt cask meant that the wine was received in London in very poor condition. And all the excitement about tasting this wine by the directors of the Virginia Company, it was a very sour and bitter taste in their mouth at that time. And it actually becomes a bit of a scandal, really, for the colonists. It's something they couldn't shake off, that they could not produce good wine in this landscape. Now, why was this? Well, it was a lot to do with the difficulties of growing grapes, but also the competition, really, of tobacco, as we know. Now, the Virginians were getting thirsty. So by 1623, they were importing many different wines because wine was not successful from their own colony lands. And the governor actually put price control, so tariffs on sherry, Canary wine, Malaga wine, Alicante, Tent, Muscadel. Tent, by the way, comes from the Spanish tinto, meaning red, and Bastard, which was a sweet blended wine from the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, potentially linked to the Bastardo grape variety. 1622, also there were some difficulties. So there was a lot of grumblings from the directors in London, but the Great Indian Massacre of 1622, which cost the lives of around a third of the colonists. Now, of course, there's discussion to be had around the massacre of the colonists, but also massacres of Indians too. That's for another presentation, another podcast. But the problems here is a reduction in population and then a huge reduction in materials and infrastructure due to the problems posed by the Indians. So you can imagine the stockholders, 1607, 1608, lots of promise. 15 years later, the promise was not fulfilled, certainly for wine production. No records of actual wine production exist, but if there were to be any, it will be small and it will be mainly local and domestic. The last official encouragement of wine growing in 17th century Virginia was an Act of Assembly of 1658, offering £10,000 of tobacco for anyone to make 2 tons of wine raised from a vineyard of the colony. The prize was never claimed. There's no record of this. So, of course, it seems like nobody had any success in the 17th century. So let's talk about some of the early difficulties then of the colonists to produce wines. Put this into perspective. What are the reasons for discouraging results of wine production? Now, first of all, it is the abundance of local wine grapes. And of course, then there were quick winemaking trials. Remember in 1610, 1609, around these, they were, wow, we've got access to lots of grapes. Let's make wine from them. Unfortunately, the results were unsatisfactory because they tasted these wines, and the first descriptor comes out for a lot of these wines, which is foxy. And foxy is a colonist American term for an English colonist term for American grape wine, which is kind of musty, grapey, and very different to the quality of European wine. And of course, this takes very much root in England as well, calling these wines foxy. And you will hear this term actually still described in, say, the A to Z of wine and things like that, for example. It's still a term that is used often for Native American wine. So negativity around local wine production. Very important to talk about unskilled grape growers. Now, the English were often a little bit ridiculed by the French. The English wanted to divert their kind of reliance on French wine, and they wanted to grow their own wine, but they had little skilled labor in course of English wine not really existing at this point. So there was little skilled labor in the early colonists. And in fact, for the first 10 years, it was 10 years later that French Huguenots came over to first colonize the vines here. So no amount of official encouragement, no government edict can overcome the failure of repeated trials by the colonists. So it was a bit of a paradox, right? They came over, found abundance of grapes, and they were like, well, this land can grow grapes. They import European vines, which come across and struggle and wither and die. And they're like, well, why are these vines dying, but the American ones surviving? And the American ones don't make great wine. So there was this big parody in play of production of wine. Also, we must also say that the colonists have it quite difficult at the time. So we have very difficult conditions. I'll go into that soon. But the geology here, very, very poor soils. Most of the colonists here were coastal at this point, around the James River and around coastal areas, the Chesapeake Bay. So what you tend to find is poor sandy clay soils, which is difficult for the cultivation of the vine at this time with unskilled knowledge. And then we have all of the difficulties of the environment of this landscape. From the point of the view of Vitis vinifera, the European vine, the New World was no Garden of Eden. In fact, it really was an area which would suffer the wrath of God. Lots of dangers and pestilences would be inflicted on the European vines. First, the American extremes of climate, so hot, humid summers, which cause lots of problems with disease, and then lots of very bitterly cold winters, which would kill off many very weak young vines. The summer humidity was particularly a problem. It provided a vector, a medium for fungal disease pressure, mildews, rots, and lots of problems would happen to these vines. Also, many destructive insect pests, such as the grape leaf hopper and also the grapeberry moth, would cause destruction. And of course, phylloxera, a story for another day. I've got many presentations on phylloxera. Please do read about those this was unknown at this time and was living happily eating root vines, certainly unprotected root vines from European vine stock. Okay, that brings me to the conclusion of this first video looking at Virginian history. I do hope you've enjoyed it. It's giving you that setting scene for the difficulties faced by the early Virginian colonists. Please do join me for part 2. Let's see if the story continues. Is there any success, or still do we find difficulties within Virginia when we look at the 18th century? This next video and part 3 are only available to those of you who subscribe to my Virginian mini-series. You will find the information for that in the description below this video. Please do leave a comment or any kind of question if you have anything to say about this video. But until next time, thank you very much. Enjoy your studies. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now.